Now we're a little bit tired, not because of the wonderful speakers before me, because we had lunch and it's rather warm and stuffy here. In any case, what I'd like to do is not to show you slides, because then you are too distracted. I'm going to force your mind to think about words again. And I'm also not going to bridge anything between the two gentlemen. I think they speak for themselves. So let me clarify a number of things. First of all, this is about rural areas. Well, frankly, here's the truth. Rural areas don't exist, at least not in a general sense. They are extremely diverse. We cannot generalize. The difference between a Swiss canton or a French area, or let alone areas in the US, in Eastern Europe, in Asia and Africa, they're all so different that we cannot really easily generalize about rural areas. Yet we all have misconceptions about them. One is they're getting emptier and emptier. Well, that's not true. In fact, if you look at the UN statistics on the rural population, it looks like they become emptier, but that is because as soon as you have an urban center, the rural population is actually reclassified as urban. So let's not forget that there is a lot of human potential in those so-called empty rural areas. Secondly, rural areas are often thought of as being backward and depending mainly on agriculture, which may be very advanced. Think of the American Midwest or the Cerrado in Brazil, but generally backward, conservative. That is not true either. In fact, many rural areas now have new services come to them because there is more land, because there is more possibility to also have cheaper labor. And so some rural areas are actually modernizing quite rapidly, even if it looks as if they are empty and even if it looks as if they are conservative. Rural areas are not conservative, but they're also not the paradise that people think they are when they go on holiday in beautiful parts of Switzerland or beautiful parts of Canada and so on. If you look at the health of rural people, that's generally worse than in urban areas, just because health services are worse. And also the number of people dying from COVID, for example, was much higher in the rural areas than it was in urban areas, notwithstanding the greater risk of infection. So rural areas are a very complex phenomenon that depend very much on the linkages with the cities that are in the rural areas or just at the margins of those rural areas. And the key issue is how to best exploit those linkages between the rural and urban areas. You see now urban areas expanding into rural areas because of land, but also because some of the services, think IT services, require a lot of space and a lot of relatively cheap energy. So that's my first statement. Let's not generalize about rural areas, and let's find tailor-made specific solutions for specific rural conditions. And they're not the same, but they need a rural policy at the government level that is specific enough to take into account these differences between rural areas. Secondly, I want to say something about resilience. I actually start to like the word resilience better than the word sustainability, and that's because about everything nowadays is sustainability, and it's a little bit like the saying, we all know what love is, but nobody has a definition. Well, we all know what sustainability is, but nobody has a really watertight definition. In contrast to that, resilience, at least in biophysical terms, has a good definition. And my definition of resilience is that it deals with two things. The resilience, so the capacity to deal with a shock, how deep is the shock, and how quick is the response time. So if you have a curve, for example, if a trend curve, I'll do it mirror face for you. This is my trend curve, or whatever, productivity, population growth. I have a shock. How deep you go from your trend curve and how quickly you're back on your trend curve. Those are two very clear dimensions of resilience as far as I'm concerned. And those are measurable dimensions, which is much easier in a way to deal with this than sustainability. Yes, sustainability is of importance because it has now all kind of regulatory aspects. Fortunately, resilience is not yet there, but I would recommend thinking about resilience a little bit more in depth. Now, the word I want to coin here is something like preventive resilience, because I think the key issue today is not to act when the shock has been there, or when there is a problem, but to think ahead of how can we afford to avoid all kinds of shocks. And to give you one example from my own country, we have, of course, with 2/3 of the Dutch economy being below sea level, we have a rather big problem with water. So we did all kinds of calculations a couple of years ago, and one of the things was initially, okay, let's have higher dikes and then we'll deal with the water. That doesn't work, because the water comes from all sides, and when there is both rainfall and there's lots of water coming from Germany and there's sea level rise, you cannot deal with that. So what you need is to create spaces to have the water, or give the water in a way, a temporary housing before it actually seeps down into the soil or before it can be evacuated to the sea. So you need, in a way, the opposite of water spaces where you use lakes for energy. You can use actually the water stored for energy, but to create water storage as a temporary solution is a good idea. We tried that out in Bangladesh, because they have a similar problem with the Brahmaputra, and actually it works there as well. And I call that sort of preventive resilience. Rather than defending yourself against the water, think about how to deal with a temporary shock and then get back up to your trend curve. Now, thirdly, this is about agriculture. Agriculture is also one of the things that are really difficult to define, indeed, from your Zambian farmer to the largest Brazilian or American farmers to our wonderful Swiss farmers that produce the most lovely cheese in the world. No French people here, I suppose, so we can safely say that. But agriculture has a couple of aspects for the future that I would like to discuss with you, particularly when it comes to innovation. First of all, let's think about the fact that by 2050, most of our CO2 will not come, most of our production of fossil fuels will be phased out. It will be a little bit still, but very little. That means that all the petrochemicals, so the byproducts of the fossil production, say, for example, for chemicals, for whatever types of plastics you need, all those byproducts of petrochemicals will have to come from another source, which is in fact the same source as fossil fuels, only not fossil, and that is current biomass, i.e. agriculture. So agriculture is going to be a really important player in 2050 or beyond when it comes to producing biomass, not just for straw and so on, but also really as an industrial ingredient. And that will change the face of farming. Secondly, the most limiting factor today in agriculture all over the world, and here I am generalizing, but it's true, is labor. Even in Africa, labor is getting scarce. Why? Because young people don't want to be standing with a hoe and working even 2 hectares. They want to go to the cities, even if that means living in very great poverty as well. So labor is our shortage. And that means that everything we do needs to be labor saving in the future. Secondly, as some of you have pointed out, and Beat in particular, we need to think about how to deal with land. Yes, there is enough land, particularly in continents like Africa and Latin America, to feed many more people than we feed today. And just to give you the demography of the whole situation of the land population balance, if I look at the end of this century, say before 2100, world population stands at about 10 billion, maybe a little over. Out of those 10 billion, 5 billion will be in Asia, with declining populations in East Asia, such as China. 4 billion will be in Africa, and the 1 billion left will be North and South America, Europe, and Australia. So that's what the situation looks like. And that means that the only place where there is still labor, in theory, is Africa, because in Asia is, of course, much more industrialized. But we will not solve the labor issue. We will not solve the land issue either if we don't take as our fundamental tenet for the future of agriculture and the food chain resource use efficiency. we had already talked about it a little bit, but I mean really an efficiency, and efficiency sometimes is a bad word for some people, but I don't think with economists so much, but efficiency of having higher output per unit of input, whether it's energy, whether it's chemicals and so on. And don't forget, yes, the major improvements in the last 100 years have been in plant breeding, but also through the use of fertilizer. Particularly poor soils cannot function without fertilizer, and Africa has about 4 kilos of fertilizer per hectare, and you will know in your own countries how it is. So there is a huge demand still for those inputs. But whatever you do, it needs to be resource efficient, and most chemicals, whether it's fertilizer or crop protection, it's all being wasted because it's not applied in the right way. If we want resource use efficiency, then the next question is, what can innovation do? And how can we save land through innovation? The key issue that the Eat Land Food report, of course, proposed was to reduce animal production. I'm to some extent in agreement, but not always and not everywhere, for two fundamental reasons. One is there's very good evidence that the consumption of some animal products, particularly animal proteins related to the minerals that come with them, such as iron, are essential for 3 parts of the population. That is, mothers who are lactating or are pregnant, young children, and the elderly over 60. They need that concentration of animal products that are quite impossible to get from plant products. The rest of us, healthy adults as we are, we can certainly be on a vegan diet if necessary. So, but we need to have some land for animal production. Now, fortunately, a lot of land that is not suitable for crops can be used for animal production. But there is land in the world that cannot be used for crop production. It's either too cold, too steep, too dry, or what have you. Think of the Gobi Desert, think of the Pampas of Argentina. There are all kinds of, or in the Middle East, there are all kinds of areas that are not suitable for crop production. They will be needed for animal production. The key to the future, if we think purely of agriculture, will be, apart from labor and those innovations, also water. And it's here that I think all innovation comes together. I'm very excited by the new things that are happening in terms of monitoring through AI in combination with satellite imagery, what happens to water use efficiency in crops, what happens to the way water is used on the surface areas. So there is a lot of really detailed tracking of crops that we can do today. And yes, those farmers, even in Africa, can have a phone. And I've seen them using phones with an app that we partly developed also in Wageningen, which is just looking at the greenness of the leaf to say something about the fertilizer conditions, about possible diseases. They can be linked up to a database. They can get advice about what to do and when to apply things. In China, this is now standard for most areas. So I think there is an enormous potential to combine, indeed, precision genetics with monitoring systems that are AI-driven, but not necessarily, that also just have an access to big data. So the question is, what do we need agriculture for? Or are we, if we are all reincarnating, thanks to some magic that Philip will be working, in the 100th times when we sit here again, in our rejuvenated forms, are there still farmers? And my answer is yes. Yes, there will be still farmers. Not because there are not things that we cannot do in the labs. There is quite some advancement in producing proteins in the lab, either directly from animal tissue, which is still very expensive. I don't think that is the way forward. But from either using yeast or directly using proteins with a kind of structure actually does produce you something which looks a little bit similar to the proteins that humans consume. But you cannot produce carbohydrates in a lab. Just the volume of carbohydrates that we will need for the future is going to be too big. So we will need agriculture for carbohydrates, and probably also for things like tree crops, including the very important, from a nutritional point of view, almonds and nuts and so on. Yes, tomatoes can be done in vertical farming. You can now grow tomatoes. We just demonstrated that at Wageningen. You can grow tomatoes without a tomato plant and without a tomato flower. But these are still things that are a couple of decades down the road. So we'll need farming for two important reasons. On the animal side, as I said, to produce the minimum of proteins and minerals. On the other side, because of the carbohydrates, but also to manage the land. Because it is not true that if we take away, say, 30% of the land from agriculture and put it into nature, that by itself is going to produce nature. Most of the landscape that we Europeans really like and consider beautiful are in fact byproducts of agriculture. Think of Tuscany, think of the Alps and so on. Those are carefully manicured types of farming systems where the beauty is also in the tradition and so on. So the solution for rural areas and for this new type of agriculture, including all its innovations, is to have a tightly monitored system where indeed farmers can also be linked to urban consumers. Because in the end, the link with the urban support for rural areas, not just as a subsidy drain, but as part and parcel of how the future of every country looks like, is going to be important. We will need farmers. That means, by the way, that we will need to have young people who want to take up farming, and they will only do that when it's really cool, meaning high tech, meaning sufficient income, and not being completely isolated. So all those are conditions. Am I optimistic? Yes, I think we can do that. And one thing that I would like to say here is there is very little exchange, I think, between people working on the overall future of rural areas and farming in different parts of the world. And I think it would be very nice, Philip, if we can have a kind of exchange from different rural areas. What are the solutions that are being tried today? What are the handicaps? What can we learn from one another? But the rural areas are there even if 60% of the world population soon lives in cities. So yes for farming, yes for rural areas, but with a lot of nuance. Thank you very much.